the next episode of The Professor and the CEO. I'm Ben Gillam, CEO of ThirdWay Group, and the reason that I wanted to do these sessions with Rachel was I found the advice that Rachel has given me on business and crisis and management invaluable, and we really wanted to share that with the business community, both the research that goes into it and also the on-the-ground experience of going through crisis and just management and what it feels like to be a CEO in that situation. So that was very much the motivation, and I'm very grateful for all the great comments we've had about people enjoying it and learning from it. And so that's a little brief introduction to me, and over to Rachel.
My name is Rachel Doern, and I'm a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship, and I do research on entrepreneurship in times of crisis. So I focus on crisis management and resilience. And as you know, today we're going to be talking about improvisation and flexibility, which is really important in times of crisis. And just to suggest to everybody joining us today that we have a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So if you do have any questions, we'll get to those nearer to the end of the session. So thanks for that. So I just want to begin by saying a few words about flexibility. So what I found in my prior research on entrepreneurship in crises, but also in relation to more current discussions with CEOs like Ben, business owners and entrepreneurs more generally, is that during this time of difficulty, during the pandemic, that effectively dealing with such does have a lot to do with flexibility and with this notion of continual adaptation and learning, and also having the confidence to deal with events, to adapt. So crises can be viewed as situations that, while difficult and even devastating at times, also provide opportunities for organizations to demonstrate flexibility, to essentially to change the way that things are done within the business. So flexibility around the focus of the organization in terms of the business offer, so what you provide in terms of products or services, to flexibility to change the way things are done in relation to operations and how they're configured. Also flexibility in terms of thinking about the strategy and how the strategy might be repositioned or realigned. And also it's an opportunity to change the way that things are done in terms of the current configuration of how business teams function, as well as different departments. So crises can be seen as opportunities to break down silos that have been built up over time within organizations, especially slightly larger organizations. The view here is that information flows quite freely within business teams and within departments, but not necessarily across them. So crisis can provide an opportunity for people to come together and for that information to flow more freely. So being flexible in these areas in terms of strategies and structures and processes can really help organizations adjust during times of crisis. And these things are also associated with what we refer to as organizational resilience, which is essentially the ability of the organization to bounce back during or following adversity, or to maintain a stable equilibrium throughout adversity through flexibility, and also through the strengths, the resources, and assets that an organization possesses that we've talked about prior. So I want to come to you, Ben, now to ask you.
It's like every area, it really is. I mean, obviously, there's the obvious piece of the staff being disparate, so you're all in separate locations and having to be flexible in how you work and how you engage with each other. But I think when it comes down to the key functions of the organization in terms of looking at the business, how we operate, how we process things, we just took a really sort of like I would say drastic, but just a big approach, and said we need to be flexible with everything. We need to be agile. Whatever the normal processes are, if they're not fit for the situation we're in, we need to park them and really, really focus upon making decisions quickly and being flexible. So what it meant was some of the management lines we broke up. It was actually in normal trading, we can afford to wait 10 days for something to work its way up the chain. In this situation, we can't. So we streamlined a lot of that. Also, we were very honest with individuals. You need different personalities in an organization. And some personalities just naturally aren't flexible. And actually, you want them to be flexible 80-90% of the time and make sure the business is following a process. And it was very quickly sort of taking that personality piece out of it and changing the operations of the business so that everyone realized you had to be flexible, or at least open to flexibility. So all processes, always we engaged with clients, how quickly new products were pushed up the chain for consideration, investment considerations, scaling back considerations, all went through a much more flexible and fast-tracked approach.
And can you give us some examples, if you can, in relation to how maybe your departments or teams had to be reconfigured or restructured as a result of the crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a business, we're always quite focused upon our market and what's next. You know, being design driven, being creative driven, you are constantly looking for that change in trend or trying to lead in trends. So I think that was a benefit for us going into this crisis, that there was a mindset towards that. But what we focused on was not so much us, but what's happening to our industry, what's happening to our clients. Because we could come up with the best trend in the world, but if it's not relevant to the market in which we operate, well, nobody's going to adopt it. So what we looked at was, what are the fundamental changes that are going to come in the office leasing market? You know, we work with both tenants who take leases and landlords who grant leases. What are their new demands? What are their new problems? How can we solve those problems? And what that meant was about 80% of the business was in a really good place. It was actually, we're at the front end of solving those problems. The problems now need to be phrased in a different way and approached in a slightly different way. And we need to be incredibly more proactive at converging the needs of landlords and tenants. That's where we focused it. And that was great for 80% of the business. And it meant we had opportunities to bring in new products, which we've launched during COVID. But it also meant there was 20% of the business that actually wasn't as relevant for the market we're going into as it was for the pre-COVID market. And so we made the decision that actually we need to reduce the size of these teams, because these product lines will hold the business back because they're not relevant for our clients or the market. And so that was the sort of the best example I can give of how we had to go about that exercise.
Great, thank you. So just pushing this theme of flexibility a little bit further. So as I inferred, flexibility can lead to a new focus, to a new direction, to a new change in strategy, ultimately, which brings into play the notion of pivoting. So we've all been hearing a lot about this word pivoting over the last little while. So pivoting is essentially pivoting away from the current strategy of the organization and pursuing a new course of direction. And in normal circumstances, this idea of pivoting, of making the decision to move away from what you've done in the past and persevere with a complete change in strategy, has been among the most difficult decisions that someone like yourself will have to make. And these kinds of decisions are often made when there's a kind of change. So when an organization changes its goals, when the business environment changes, as in the case of the current crisis, or when the client base changes, or so on and so forth. And as a result, the pivots that an organization adopts will usually have these changes in mind. They will be to respond to these specific changes. And just to give you a few examples, and then it'd be great to sort of gauge your experience of such, Ben. We have what's referred to as a zoom in pivot or a zoom out pivot. So a zoom in pivot is really when an organization decides to refocus the business offer on what previously was just maybe a small aspect or feature of its larger offering. So let's say a business that provides consultancy, surveillance, design, planning, building works, and legal advice, all of these things, now decides that we're actually just going to focus on one of those branches. That's an example of the zoom in pivot. An example of the zoom out pivot is when what's been regarded as the entire product or service offering in the past is no longer sufficient in the current climate. And so then the organization adds something to its profile. So one of the most ready examples I can come up with is that of a bottle shop in my area that sells spirits and wine and beer. That since the crisis and the shift towards localization and this idea that people are not traveling as much, even to shop as they used to, they are now focusing on providing, in addition to those things, foodstuffs, and have become a small, quaint, old-fashioned grocers as well. So that would be an example of a zoom out pivot. So now turning to you, Ben, since the crisis.
it's interesting, isn't it? Because going back to sort of the origin, perhaps, of like why you zoom in or zoom out is because you need to change or pivot. And I've often found change the most fascinating word, or the reactions to change is the most fascinating thing in a business. That half the business see it as positive, half see it as negative before you've even talked about the change. Where change of itself is neutral. It's you're doing it because as a consequence of what's going on. And it's really interesting thinking of zoom in and zoom out, because zoom out suggests like a new product line of something you haven't done before, whereas zooming is, okay, we've got this product line, this is where we should put our attention, and the others perhaps we pass away. So I think we've zoomed in, but the outward manifestation to the outside world might look like we've zoomed out. What we've really looked at is what we specialize in is working with tenants and working with landlords. And actually, like I have to say, tenants and landlords have kind of like an arranged bad marriage. They sort of get together, sign a contract, and then don't speak to each other for 5 years until they need to sign a contract again. And they say, should we stay together or should we leave? Let's sign a new contract and stay together. What we've really focused in on is like enhancing that relationship. So saying, actually, you're in quite an intense relationship together where you provide a building, a service, and you provide a significant amount of your income and your profits to pay for that service. Well, why don't you make those things like really, really aligned so that you're more productive as a tenant and you have a more engaged tenant as a landlord who's more likely to stay in your building or your portfolio long term. So we've really zoomed in on that relationship to make sure that our products enhance that relationship. But then the manifestation of that is that some of the ways we package those products now appear different. The way we talk about them appears different. So I think an outsider looking in would say we've zoomed out, but certainly from me on the inside, I think we've really zoomed in and really like tried to solve a big problem or a good problem that exists in our industry.
Great, thank you. And there are other examples of pivots as well. So the customer segment pivot is another case. So this is where the product attracts kind of a different customer base than the product was originally designed for. So let's say you're a manufacturer of a skincare line or a clothing line, and you're originally targeting one segment or several segments, but you notice that another segment is actually buying those products more so, and you decide, to the exclusion of the other segments, that you're just going to focus everything on that one segment. And I don't know if it's the best example, but it does remind me of what's happening now in the tourism industry with hotels. And I think we talked about this a little bit before, but this notion that a lot of hotels are really suffering because international tourism is down pretty much to an all-time low, and domestic tourism is a little bit down as well. And as a result, we have all these hotels, think about London, all these, I was just staying in within the city center recently, and in a very big hotel, and it was probably at 10% capacity, but there's an opportunity there at the same time to maybe focus on another segment, which is the residential market, and providing rooms to those individuals, perhaps at a discount. So people who would like to stay for an occasion or whatever the reason at a hotel for the weekend. So a customer segment pivot is another example, or a customer need pivot, which is all about the fact that the problem solved by the problem solved by the product is no longer deemed to be important or as important as it once was. So this view that after receiving customer feedback, or even in a time of crisis, that these needs have effectively changed, which I think you alluded to before, Ben. So an example, so in this situation, the organization might need to reposition its products or to create entirely new products as a result. And for lack of a better example, but I'll turn to you in a moment, Ben, I can think of Zara, which of course we all know makes designs, nice clothes for women, men, and children, mostly women. And during the crisis, actually started manufacturing masks and gowns as well. So repositioning or making a new product over a short period of time to respond to that. So Ben, would you say that you...
Service provider, we're quite agnostic as to which industry we work with, because most industries need a physical base of some description. So we have quite a sort of a wide range of clients. But what has been interesting is very much, as you discussed, about creating a product that you think is targeted at one set of clients and all of a sudden the uptake from a different set of clients like shows you that gives you a different perspective. So one of the things we worked on was on our workplace team, really sort of cutting through a lot of the noise and the nonsense that was being thrown out about the future of the office, and saying, no, focus on the future of your business, and that will inform your choices for the office. Now, we really thought about our core sort of SME businesses when we put that product together. We really wanted to help smaller businesses, really rationalize that. But what was amazing was it was large corporates and government institutions and organizations we would never have expected to work with, who really adopted that and were really open to saying, actually, this is like a once in a business cycle, even for some of them, like a once in a history opportunity to really reassess the way they go about their business or their function and what their space should look like. So the adoption has been much more from a corporate level than from the level we were particularly aiming at. So what that meant was we did have to quickly sort of adjust that and fine tune that ever so slightly to suit that audience, because it's a slower process that you'll go through, whereas before we were very much looking at helping businesses in the immediate sort of get a grip of the crisis. So it was a good and enjoyable pivot, I must say, but yeah, a shock as well.
And just for interest's sake, do you see that as being sustainable in the long term, or you see how it pans out in the short term?
I think it is sustainable in the long term. Like for us as a business, I think that these large sort of corporate and institutions, they tend to like to work with businesses with long histories, and we're probably that sort of middle ground now, where we've been around for 11 years and turn over £100 million a year. So we sort of now start to fit into that criteria of business they could work with. But I think if it wasn't for the crisis, they'd probably be working with the 30-year-old consultancy who they'd worked with for the last 15 years. I think there was something about this crisis that has really challenged workplace teams and property teams in large organizations to say, now's the time for real change, not just superficial change. So I do believe that will be a long-term trend and market for us. What I hope, and I sincerely hope for the whole of my industry, is this openness to the workplace, the office, the environment you create for staff is maintained. I really hope that it's not something that's discussed and then sort of put on the back burner, because all the evidence suggests a well-designed environment creates a productive and happy workforce. And that's what people should be focused on, but in my sector right now.
Absolutely.
There was a trend in our industry, and again, thinking about that leasing event where landlord and tenant sign agreement together for shorter term leases, and also an increased willingness from landlords to carry the capital expenditure of fitting out those offices, of making them fit for use, fit for purpose, and incredibly well designed. There was a trend. But it was sort of like any, I suppose, significant change to a market, sort of like, bumping along and gradually increasing as time went on. What COVID has done, and the following economic crisis, has really pushed that need forward. Landlords now increasingly will have to offer shorter leases, and they will have to cover the capital expenditure for those tenants so they can occupy those leases. So although we already provided the services for doing that, how now we've broken up those services to enable a landlord to make their building more attractive and more tenant friendly and more engaged for tenants has changed. And equally, the way we're engaging with the tenants and advising them as to how their space should operate and what they can ask of a landlord and how long they should be in that occupation, how they monitor it, has changed. So there's not, as they say, like the fundamental change to service, but what sort of brought it to a head is like the behaviors changed. And so we have to make sure the product range is absolutely on point with the behaviors.
Okay, cheers. And of course, there are many other examples of pivots as well, and I won't go into all of them, but they could include things like a business architecture pivot. So when companies really need to think about the volume, margins, trade-off, and balancing such. So maybe historically a company is focused on high volumes and low margins, and now as a result of the crisis, perhaps they're shifting more towards high margins and low volumes. I don't know if that's relevant to you, Ben, or the technology pivot where people are sort of changing the emphasis on technology or the kind of technology that they use to achieve their solutions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the I wouldn't quite say it's a mistake yet, but one of the things I sort of will look back on is how much change we sought to implement in these, what has it been, 5 months? That all those areas you've discussed, the way we report, the technology we use to report, the modifications to the dashboards that individuals see, as you said, the business architecture of roles and responsibilities, of control of P&Ls, of control of budgets, of reductions of staff, of recruitments, has all changed, and all in a really agile way. But I think sometimes you can try and do too much, and it could well be that trying to oversee such a wholesale change can be challenging as well. So all of those items you've talked about, I can say, yeah, as a business, we look to them and we've sort of looked to execute on all of them. But I sort of wonder as a CEO that whether I didn't do my job well enough at actually saying, hey, we're building this momentum in the business of change and agility. But sometimes you can put the brakes on and say, we need to prioritize things and fine tune things now along the way.
And I guess historically, when people are often making these pivots, they do it around a particular change, or they make a pivot as opposed to pivoting so many things at once, which a lot of organizations are being faced with now as a result of the crisis, really. So I want to say a few words about improvisation as well, which is also about flexibility, and it can be seen as a flexible response to uncertainty, to instability or volatility in the environment that may be caused by a crisis or otherwise. And so improvisation is really all about taking actions, usually spontaneous actions that are deliberate, but yet unplanned or planned over very short periods of time. So there's usually some kind of time constraint or time pressure. And the narrower the time between when the action was planned and when the action was executed, the more likely it is that the behavior in question will be improvised. And just to give you a few examples of the kinds of behaviors that an organization may improvise, we may talk about finding new solutions to problems over a relatively short period of time. It may involve finding new uses for existing methods or approaches. It may involve deviating from plans to make use of arising or emerging opportunities as a result. So just to give you a quick example from some of my previous research on the London riots, which took place over August of 2011, and I was focused on small businesses who were affected by those events, who were looted, vandalized, and or burned down by rioters over that period. And some people could do nothing about it, and they were notified after the fact that their businesses had been affected, and others were given notice over a relatively short period of time and then responded as a result. So I'm thinking of two individuals, both of which who owned in different boroughs in London clothing stores. One was a small couture store, so they made everything by hand. I'm talking about evening gowns and bridal wear. And basically, this company was contacted by a neighbor to say that the rioters were on their way, and they had about 20 minutes to react. And so they thought about what can we do, and what, if anything, can we save over that period of time. So they grabbed everything from the vault, and in particular focused on bridal gowns for weddings that were coming up over the next few weeks, and materials that were very difficult to replace. So that's one example. Another example was also someone who owned a clothing store, not a couture store, but a high-end clothing store, who was also notified by someone that his place had been broken into. So the rioters had entered into his premises, but he then went down, armed with a crowbar and a dog, which I wouldn't recommend, and stood guard all night to protect his business. Because, after contacting the police, and a lot of people did, because police forces were under-resourced and they couldn't respond at all or quickly enough, that people in some cases took matters into their own hands. So two examples of people who responded quite quickly to finding solutions for problems. So then my question to you, Ben, is in what ways has your business had to improvise over the last few weeks and months to make and execute plans very quickly? And so it could be in relation to finding solutions to problems. It could be in relation to finding new approaches to things that you do. It could be in relation to deviating from existing plans to take advantage of those emerging opportunities.
Yeah, two spring to mind, and they're both the different extremes of what we do. Very early on in COVID, see, a lot of what I work is about delivering the product on effectively building sites, and every day we were having to improvise as to, are our sites staying open? Are they closing? How do we manage that with our clients? What's the contractual obligation? What's the health and safety obligation for our operatives? How are we managing them? How are we managing our staff? And like every day there was this improvisation of how are you going to achieve this? But also then, as you were doing these short-term sort of movements, you had to think long-term as well. Hang on, we need to safeguard material. We need to safeguard security. We need to update our health and safety files. So there was tons of like on the ground improvisation where management teams within half an hour of a government briefing or of a publication had to prepare working environments for 2,000 people the next day, and how to do that in a safe way without making sure the business had any liabilities. And it was incredibly taxing, to be honest, but that was one way. And that was sort of the very sort of reactive like way. You know, we were being as proactive as we could, but you waited for the briefing, then you were completely reactive. Another way, which was again the completely opposite extreme, for about a year, 18 months even, we've been investing in a really fantastic software tool to help the business development function, to sort of give us sort of an edge on the market of speaking to clients at the right time. But COVID kind of threw that out the window, because how you would track things, how you would monitor things went out the window when you're in a crisis, and things are just changing drastically, and values of businesses are being depressed. So we had this like amazing software tool, this amazing amount of data, and it was like, well, what are we going to do with it? Because there's still sort of like gold in there. And the team very quickly improvised a way of using that to the business's benefit and for business development purposes and finding new clients. And I won't go into sort of like the detail of it, but just really quickly and really cleverly to use it to our advantage. So what could have been a huge investment that you just parked or even thought you wasted very quickly became one of the biggest assets to your business in a crisis.
That's really interesting. And I also want to say a few words about when improvisation is effective. So improvisation tends to be especially effective in organizations where there is a lot of uncertainty, but also in organizations where a certain degree of errors or imperfections are acceptable or tolerable, which may be in general or over a period of time. So errors are seen as sources of learning for these organizations. And there's a focus on being good enough as opposed to being perfect. Secondly, improvisation is effective in situations where organizational structures and explicit rules and routines are limited or minimal. And individuals have some autonomy over their work, and they are also rewarded for taking initiative, for making an effort, and even for taking risks. So that's not to say that you leave people entirely to their own devices, but it is about giving people time and space in which to carry out their work. But the key here in terms of creating a culture that supports these kinds of organizations is to ensure that everyone's still on the same page, that the key objectives are still in mind, and that there are short-term milestones that the organization can set to ensure that people are on the right track. And this sort of reminds me of entrepreneurship a little bit. So this idea of companies who continually innovate and continually adapt, not just in terms of times of crisis, but in general. So organizations like 3M or Google that again give their people time and slack within their working day or working week to focus on their own projects that contribute ultimately to the organization with all the resources that they need or are required. And it's also the case that improvisation is especially effective in situations where organizational members of the team have a certain degree of openness to new experiences, to new ideas. And I think as we were discussing during this session or earlier, Ben, this idea that not everyone is able to think in these terms, to be creative, to think outside the box, to think abstractly. And this is considered to be a personality characteristic or trait, which is something that you can select for, something you can recruit for if you're the kind of organization that wants to utilize a personality inventory over that process. But having said that, at the same time, improvisation is something that people can practice and is something that organizations can learn. So if you think about improvisation from a comedy perspective, if you think of improv, it's really about listening to people, thinking about what people are saying, empathizing, reacting to certain cues, and at the same time being knowledgeable about what other people know and being knowledgeable about what other people can achieve, what they can do, what they can accomplish. So really it's about the kind of culture that you create for your organization. So Ben, I don't know if you have any comments on that in your experience.
No, I totally do. And improv's a great example, isn't it? Because I remember reading Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, and he talks about the key to improv is consent. Like if you don't consent to what's put in front of you, it falls over. And like that's the challenge for an organization. And if I think of the history of ThirdWay and my leadership, like when we started, the first 30, 40 employees, as I was recruiting, I wanted an all-rounder. I wanted someone who could think laterally, think in the abstract, and take their hand to many different things. And then as you grow as an organization, what you realize is, oh no, I need specialists. And where we've probably changed from being a big small company to a small big company, you can end up actually by accident suppressing improvisation and creativity. And so we've worked really hard at giving managers autonomy in the last 18 months for exactly that reason, to say you have the consent to work things out for your team, and then have that management tier above, like hovering, saying there has to be some rules for consent, in that you can't run away with something that's going to be great for your team but then harm the wider business. It has to dovetail into what we're doing, and it has to be able to improve the organization as a whole. So a great example of that is our project management team, Sam, who heads that up, basically decided that the software we were using to monitor and track was just clunky and was getting in the way. And he had the complete freedom to just go and sign up on a new license, get something else going, trial it, demonstrate the value it brought to that team, and then that's been rolled out across the whole business. So I totally agree with you. It comes from the top. Like if the leadership team are open to innovation, you will find innovation. If they give that consent, you will always find individuals who will bring it into the business.
Great. And I want to turn now, just because we're nearing the end of the session, to a couple of the questions that we had from viewers. So the first question is,
I think I often say to my team, it's like your confidence in the present comes from your success in the past. That it's building upon what you know about your industry, about your job, about your role, and that sort of is all the ingredients you often need to say what's the change that's needed, what's the new product that we need to bring to market, and then as you grow as a business, you then have a team who might market test that, and have a marketing division who challenge that. But I would say, and I say it to again all the staff when they join, it's treat it as a university degree. Year one, you run around not quite knowing what you're doing but enjoying it. Year two, you realize, oh, I'm quite good at this and I can still do a bit of running around. And year three, you specialize. Like if you know your market, if you know your job, if you know the nuances of it, like have conviction and confidence in that product that you're bringing to market, and be passionate about it. Because if you're not going to be passionate about it, don't expect anybody else to be. But also, and I've failed at this in the past, so I've not been perfect at this. If you need to put measures in place to challenge yourself. So if 3 months down the line the product isn't being adopted, like you need to be honest with yourself: is it the right product? Do we need to change it? Have I got the right people promoting it? Is there some kind of herd rejection in the market? And modify it and go again and go again. And also set yourself a time for when you'll kill the product if it's wrong. Because there's no point throwing good money after bad if actually you've called it wrong, and learn from that experience. And also, my brother is a big reader of business books. He often sends me like snippets and sends me books to read. Like you won't find a CEO or an entrepreneur who's not got one or two of them wrong. So just don't beat yourself up too much about it either. So dust yourself down, analyze it, go again.
I think that's great advice. And let's take another question.
We've put a lot of thought into it, and again, like I've not always got comms right in the business. I think I've often talked about the difference between openness and transparency. So what we've really focused on in COVID is being as transparent as we possibly can all the time to the business, and giving people the credit that they will be able to grasp all of the things that are going on. So there's obviously an economic issue, there's a public health issue, there's a confidence issue, there's a consumer confidence issue, there's real estate issues, there's financial issues, and then there's the business issues. And what we've tried to do is give everyone a summary of all of those things and what that means for us, so that the decisions we're making, although they can't always be pleasing to everyone, at least people can see the rationale and the logic and the lengths we've gone to make the right decision for the business and have conviction in that decision. So the comms piece is trusting the staff with that information, being as transparent as you can, and also like really think about it. You know, our people team and our ops team are really good at sort of putting the two together, what we need to say and the people we're saying it to and what they need to hear and how it needs to land.
That's great. And that's all we have time for. So perhaps just briefly to summarize by saying that flexibility is important, especially during times of crisis. And although it's very difficult for many people and many organizations to go through this time, to go through this period of pandemic, that we can also see it as an opportunity to change some of the things that we do, some of the ways in which we do things, and to think about what kind of changes need to be made, but also what kinds of changes we can anticipate as well, and how we might have to pivot as a result to reposition our product or service offering, but at the same time, as Ben suggested or alluded to, maybe not doing too much at the same time, thinking about what the most important changes are to come. And also it's about creating this kind of in order to establish or to be more flexible within your organization. It's also about creating a certain kind of culture that is amenable to listening to others, to giving people a certain degree of autonomy, while at the same time balancing the needs and objectives of the organization, and ensuring that milestones are set. So that's it from me today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much, guys. And Rachel, that was a pleasure. I really enjoyed that session.
Me too. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.